In November of 1872, Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife and daughter, and a modest crew of 7 men set sail on the brigantine ship the Mary Celeste from the New York port with a full cargo set to be delivered to Genoa, Italy. Nearly a month later, another ship named the Dea Gratia, which left the same port as the Mary Celeste 8 days later and was bound to the same destination, came across the Mary Celeste drifting in the open Atlantic water aimlessly, still a long way from their destination. The crew of the Dea Gratia boarded the Mary Celeste in hope of finding its crew and to offer any assistance they might need, but when they searched about the ship, they were met with nothing but empty cots, half-eaten meals, and a fateful mystery which would continue to go unsolved to this very day. Join me in this episode as we look into the mystery of what happened to the disappearing crew of the Mary Celeste 150 years ago. Welcome back to Moonlight Lore, everyone. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins. In this episode, I'll be delving into the century-and-a-half-long mystery of the disappearance of the Mary Celeste's entire crew while out in the middle of the Atlantic. Now, to start off, let's take a quick trip back to 1860 when the Mary Celeste, but at the time was named Amazon, was built at the Nova Scotian port community of Spencer's Island. During its construction, the brigantine ship was made from locally produced lumber and was built at length of roughly 30 meters, or 100 feet, with 2 towering masts made specifically for hauling cargo across the Atlantic Ocean. Even though it only took a year for its construction to finish, its successful maiden voyage of delivering lumber from Nova Scotia to London proved that the Amazon was a ship fully capable and reliable to any doubters back then and today. However, even with its successful voyage, Amazon became a ship which began to develop a reputation for causing troubles, even on its first journey. During its short time being flown under the British flag, the Amazon had lost its captain to illness, which resulted in his untimely death the day before it was set sail to London on its first voyage. And while traveling out of Canadian waters and along the coast of America, the Amazon constantly would run into and hit fishing equipment, destroying them in the process. And when it finally made its way to England and into the English Channel, it managed to crash into and sink another brigantine ship, also sailing through the water. But eventually, the Amazon met its end just 6 years after its first voyage, after being caught in a storm and ran aground at its home province of Nova Scotia, effectively destroying the ship to the point where its owners simply abandoned it on the shore. Now, in a sense, this was the end of the Amazon. Fortunately for us and the story, but probably not so much for its future missing crew, this wasn't the end of the ship's life. At this point in the ship's story, it was purchased by a man named Alexander McBean, who went on to sell it to the Americans, who rebuilt the ship even better than it was before. Once its second construction was finished, and a second deck was added to it, the ship was then given its new and final change, by being given the name the Mary Celeste, and its new captain, Benjamin Briggs, ready to take on the helm of the new and improved ship on its second maiden voyage. At the time, Benjamin Briggs was known as a man who, just like his father, was an excellent sea captain whose talent in sailing was evident from his past successes. When he took the helm of the Mary Celeste, he stood proud at the wheel and happy to live up to his father's name and reputation. Though by this time, Benjamin had spent nearly his entire life sailing on the ocean with his father and brothers, and was well known and very respected by his peers and those who served under him, mainly for his hard work, sailing ability, and fairness for his crew. Benjamin was also a devout Christian family man who was always proud of showing off his young family. His wife Sarah and his 2 children Arthur and Sophia were all incredibly supportive of Ben and his work. though were understandably upset by his occasional long absences because of it. It was probably because of this longing to be with him, Sarah decided to finally join her husband on what was to be one of Benjamin's last jobs, and the destination was the Italian city of Genoa. Sarah believed this would be a wonderful destination to visit with her family and a great opportunity to explore the Italian countryside. But before the trip could be underway, Benjamin had to oversee and prepare the Mary Celeste for her trip across the Atlantic. He had to pick his crew who would sail with him, and as a man so renowned for his skill as captain, he had plenty of options of eager sailors wanting to work under him. Ultimately, Benjamin settled on 7 crew members to join him and his family on the Mary Celeste. As his first mate, he chose Albert Richardson, who had sailed alongside Benjamin on multiple trips before and knew each other quite well. Second mate was Andrew Gilling, a Danish man. Edward Head was the steward, and finally 4 German men, Volkert and Boz Lorenzen, Arian Martins, and Gottlieb Gudschall, all who were described as first-class, very pleasant, and very respectable sailors. So on October 20th of 1872, Benjamin and his crew headed down to the pier where the Mary Celeste was docked at to supervise and take part in loading the ship up with its requested cargo, 1,701 barrels of alcohol. After about a week of prepping the ship, Benjamin was met with his wife Sarah and his 2-year-old daughter Sophie, who arrived at the pier, packed and ready to go for their trip. Unfortunately, school had just started and Sarah had to leave their son Arthur behind at his grandmother's to attend, but with this plan, Arthur was inadvertently saved from the outcome of what happened to his parents and sister out on the water. On the 7th of November, the Mary Celeste was finally able to raise anchor and sail after 2 long days of delay due to bad weather, which caused the ship and her crew to fall behind schedule. When the Mary Celeste finally met with the horizon, traveling into the unknown, it would be the last time her crew were ever seen again. Taking in a deep breath of the refreshing salty air, Captain David Morehouse of the Dea Gratia emerged from the bottom deck to grab a glimpse of his ship's heading. As he walked about the deck of his ship, inspecting his crew and their work, he was pleased their journey was soon at its end. The Dea Gratia, much like the Mary Celeste, was a Canadian-built brigantine made for transporting cargo across the Atlantic, and much like the Celeste, Gratia was docked at the same New York port at the same time, and set to travel the near-identical route to Genoa just a little over a week after the Celeste had already departed, which meant the Mary Celeste should have arrived at its destination in Genoa days ahead of the Dea Gratia. This fact was probably what confused Captain Morehouse when on December 4th, the helmsman called out seeing the Mary Celeste lifelessly drifting in the water just 8 kilometers ahead of them and still hundreds of kilometers away from land. The closer the Dea Gratia got, the more evident the ship was not being controlled by a single soul. The ship was drifting sporadically and the sails were set wrong from the current wind conditions. Obviously, something was wrong. Captain Morehouse had been friends with Captain Briggs. They shared a dinner previously back at the New York port where Briggs had left, and he knew the Mary Celeste well, so he ordered 2 of his men, DeVoe and Wright, to board the Celeste to investigate why no one was manning the helm or sails, and to figure out why not a single person was on deck to greet them. When the 2 men searched throughout the Celeste, they were completely dumbfounded to have found everything in near complete order. Aside from the crew being missing, there was nothing out of the ordinary that was obvious to them at the time. The entire ship was still seaworthy, with no damage besides around 2 to 3 feet of water settling on the bottom deck, which would be more than unusual for a ship of the Celeste's size, but not as dangerous or worrisome as one might think. The ship's food and water rations, which supposedly was enough to fill the stomachs of the crew and small family for close to 6 months, were still stored away. The missing sailors' personal belongings were still in their quarters, and the cargo of 1,701 barrels of alcohol were practically undisturbed aside from 9 empty ones. When inspecting the captain's quarters where Briggs and his wife and daughter were staying, they found the ship's navigation chart spread across the table as if someone was trying to determine their location. But many other charts and papers, plus navigational equipment, had been absent from the cabin. Aside from this, everything else seemed to be in order in the captain's quarters, but the men knew it would be smart to check if the ship's logs were still intact, which would offer up an explanation for the absence of the ship's occupants. According to the logs, the last notes written were from 10 days prior on November 25th and 740 kilometers away, noting the ship's position near Santa Maria Island, one of the small Portuguese islands in the Azores. With nothing hinting on where the crew went or what could have been the cause for the ship's abandonment, DeVoe and Wright headed back to the Dia Gratia to report their findings. It was decided by Morehouse and his crew there was very little they could do here, so as is common practice, the crew of the Dia Gratia split the crew to form 2 skeleton crews so they could also sail the derelict Mary Celeste to Gibraltar in Spain, 800 kilometers away, to collect salvage payment from the ship's insurer and report their findings of the missing crew. When the skeleton crews of the Dia Gratia and the Mary Celeste arrived at Gibraltar, a British-run territory on the Spanish coast, they were met with mixed feelings by those of the British Vice Admiralty Board. The whole report Captain Morehouse relayed to them sounded rather suspicious and raised more than a few eyebrows. But after a full and thorough investigation and inspection which lasted a few months of the Dia Gratia and her crew, and also the condition of the Mary Celeste, it was hesitantly decided there was no foul play involved. Captain Morehouse and his crew were then awarded salvager's payment and received 1/6 of the $46,000 for which the ship and its cargo had been insured for. This would then come close to around $7,500 for Morehouse and his crew, which in today's money would be roughly around $150,000. Eventually, once the proceedings and payment were done, the crew of the Dia Gratia departed in the name of more work, while the Mary Celeste itself was held for further inspection by curious minds, but then eventually too was released to deliver its shipment of alcohol to Genoa like it originally intended. Of course, Captain Benjamin Briggs, his family, and his crew were never seen again, and as the proceedings and inspections had been taking place over their ship, hopes of them returning dwindled every day. The Mary Celeste continued to operate as a cargo vessel for a number of years, but finding her a new crew had been quite difficult as no one felt safe to sail a ship known for losing its entire crew, and added reports of sailors and captains falling sick and dying while in her care. It was also eventually known she was notorious for losing money for those who sailed or hired her to transport. It seemed the Mary Celeste itself was the embodiment of nightmares for sailors. Eventually though, after about a decade of operation, the Mary Celeste too met its end off the coast of Haiti in December of 1884, when Gilman C. Parker, the last owner of the Celeste, purposely drove her into a known and charted coral reef, completely destroying the ship's bottom hull, causing it to sink simply for the intent of collecting a large sum of insurance money. But don't worry, karma would catch up with Parker, and the death of such a mysterious ship wouldn't go unpunished. After a long and strenuous investigation, he was convicted of insurance fraud, and was close to being convicted to barratry, the act of illegally scuttling, abandoning, or sinking a ship for financial reasons, which at the time was punishable by the death penalty. Parker was able to avoid jail time and the death penalty, but was forced to pay back the money he scanned from the insurers, which was a total of $30,000 at the time. In today's money would be close to $800,000, which understandably then put Parker well below the poverty line. It seems, though, the curse of the Mary Celeste wasn't quite done, however. Parker's reputation after the attempted scam plummeted to the point where he couldn't find any work after, and just 3 months after the hearing, Parker passed away. He wasn't the only one of his crew to suffer from their actions either. One of his crewmates had later gone mad, and another committed suicide a short time after. It would seem, even in death, the Mary Celeste's influence and supposed curse could reach further than anyone could have ever expected. Some would say the story behind the Mary Celeste is cut and dry, which in a sense it is, but the mystery of her missing captain and crew on the Atlantic in 1872 opens up a plethora of theories and conspiracies from people all around the world who are still puzzled and confused by it. Even nearly 150 years later, people far and wide are still trying to come up with an explanation to what could have happened to Briggs, his family, and the crew. Every theory, however, has its fair share of contradictory. Some are a bit more far-fetched than others, but are still fun to think of, so I'll touch on a couple of them first here. A small number of creative thinkers believe one of the theories explaining what had happened to the crew is the fact Captain Briggs, his family, and the crew were subjected to alien abduction and taken without so much of a trace. This, of course, is very, very unlikely for so many logical reasons, but I'll just say the likelihood of aliens traveling hundreds of light years to Earth to kidnap this small family and crew randomly, steal their navigational papers and tools, and also their lifeboat, it just doesn't make any sense. Second theory seems a little strange, but has been suggested, is that they were attacked by a sea monster. Now yes, this has been suggested before, and frankly it doesn't make any sense either, as the ship and its contents on board were more or less undisturbed and undamaged. Now sure, a couple sails were torn or ripped, but again, what would a sea monster have the need for navigational papers and a lifeboat? That one just doesn't work either. But now that we have those, what one could call humorous theories out of the way, we can start looking at more realistic reasons for why the crew disappeared or abandoned their ship. One theory actually involves pirates. This idea has been brought up a few times, but in all honesty, I can't say I'm in support of this one either. If pirates had attacked the Mary Celeste, what would be the gain in abducting the crew and not leaving any kind of ransom notice behind, or taking even just one of the many barrels of alcohol down in the cargo hold? The one of two things pirates are known to love, gold and booze. So this theory doesn't work for me either. Another theory that seems much more likely is that the Celeste had been caught up in a storm which caused the sails and their ropes to become slightly damaged, nearly 3 feet of water in the cargo hold, and from possible shaking and breaking, some of the barrels of alcohol leaking and becoming empty. Now this is definitely plausible, as we know storms out in the ocean can be extremely treacherous, and rain is a very common thing for this area of the Atlantic during December. If the storm winds, rains, and waves became violent enough, it's been theorized it would be enough to cause the findings of water and damage to easily occur. That, and if the storm was bad enough and a member of the Celeste crew moved below deck to check on their cargo, but to see water rising in the cargo hold, it might have been enough to jump the gun, as it were, and believe the ship was sinking. This would then result in the crew abandoning ship very quickly without their personal items, little to no food or water, leaving their extra clothing behind, every member of the crew jumping into the lifeboat, and the captain purposely making sure he grabbed his navigational charts and tools so they could find their way to land again. Of course, if this were the case, we know the ship never sank, and I'm not sure how large their lifeboat would have been, but if they thought the Celeste was sinking because of the rain, wind, and waves, their lifeboat would more than likely have flipped or sank, causing every occupant to fall out into the cold crashing waves and very likely drown. This theory, I believe, is definitely a possibility, as everything would seem to line up with the idea of bad weather being the cause. But we also must remember Captain Briggs and his crew were all very capable and experienced sailors who shouldn't have panicked and abandoned ship so easily like this theory would suggest. This next theory I have seems like the most obvious, that Captain Morehouse and the crew of the Dea Gratia murdered or commandeered the Mary Celeste in order to obtain the large sum of money for returning the ship as a derelict. Even back then, the circumstances on which Morehouse and his crew found the ship and returned it brought suspicion to those tasked with finding out what had actually happened. But even after 3 months of intense investigation by the British Inquiry, they were unable to find any foul play, but were still very much unconvinced that the story the Dea Gratia crew relayed to them. And when we think about it, we would have no clue if what Morehouse and his crew said were actually the truth. It's known Morehouse and Briggs were both friendly with each other after many years of sailing together and even sharing a meal before Briggs departed the following day, so why would Morehouse betray and murder his lifelong friend and his family? It really seems unlikely it was just for the reward money of bringing in the derelict Mary Celeste, as if any evidence or proof of Morehouse's ill intent was found, he and his crew would be in prison for quite a long time or even face the death penalty themselves. Also, I wouldn't say $150,000 is worth the price of having the deaths of a small family and innocent sailors on your conscience for the rest of your life. But people are still quick to think Morehouse and his crew had some part in the disappearances. Oftentimes people will think perhaps instead of killing the Celeste crew upright, The crew of the Gratia simply forced Briggs and his family and crew onto the lifeboat, gave them a few supplies to be able to get back to land somewhere, and then stole their ship for the reward money. Still though, I myself have a hard time believing Morehouse would betray his lifelong friend for financial gain. But more importantly, it doesn't make any sense that the Dea Gratia was able to catch up to the Mary Celeste, which departed port over a week before the Dea Gratia. This would mean the crew of the Mary Celeste would have had to abandon ship a few days before Morehouse and his crew even arrived at the ship. With no one manning the Celeste's sails or helm, it obviously had to have slowed its pace so much that the Dea Gratia was able to catch up to it, which means there is no way Morehouse and his crew could have had any part in the disappearances. This last theory I have here actually seems to be the most plausible and believable to me, in which it suggests the risk of or an actual explosion on board was to blame for the evacuation of the Mary Celeste. Just like in the previous storm theory, what seemed like the quick departure of the crew on the lifeboat from the ship is a direct response to a loud explosion caused in the cargo hold. Now, normally I would say this is rather ridiculous sounding because obviously the ship was found intact with no signs of fire. But under scientific recreation and analysis of the ship, in 2006, Dr. Andrea Sella, a chemist at the University College of London, conducted an experiment to recreate the same conditions that may have been the cause for the evacuation of the Celeste. If we take a closer look at what the Celeste was carrying, the 1,701 barrels of pure alcohol, we find the 9 empty barrels that were found were a little different than the rest. The difference between the 9 and the other 1,692 was the empty ones were made from red oak, while the rest were made of white oak. Now this is important knowing the type of wood because the white oak barrels would have occluded pores which made the wood completely watertight, while the 9 empty barrels were made from red oak wood which would have open pores which would allow its contents to seep out over time. Typically, red oak barrels were used for transporting goods such as cloth, food, or other supplies, not usually alcohol or other liquids. I imagine the reason why they had used these red oak barrels to transport the alcohol was to simply fill the order after running out of white oak barrels and planned to simply ensure the empty red oak barrels on arrival. It must have been sometime during their voyage or even while loading the barrels on board the ship, but the alcohol inside might have leaked through the wood, which allowed the smell and fumes to waft into the cargo hold. It's also worth to note, during the initial boarding of the Celeste by DeVoe and Wright, they mentioned the hatches to the cargo hold on the top deck were open, as if someone had been trying to vent the fumes out. The thing is, though, this would have been in vain as the flammable alcoholic vapors are heavier than air. It would make the attempt to draw the vapors out of the hold be ineffective. It was this that Dr. Sella wanted to test out in his laboratory. If the fumes and cargo inside would have created a reason for the crew to abandon ship so quickly. To produce an accurate experiment, he recreated the cargo hold of the Mary Celeste and used butane gas in place of the alcoholic vapors. Instead of using wooden barrels to hold the gas, he used cubes made of paper, which would act as the barrels, which allowed the gas to pass through and in between. When Dr. Sella sparked the gas inside the confined space, a sudden bright flash of flame and a loud bang was produced. One might think a quick explosion like this would leave behind evidence and be obvious enough to notice for those inspecting the ship afterwards, but the results of Dr. Sella's experiment proved quite the opposite. What he found to happen after his intended explosion was that even though there was a visible and loud explosion, it wasn't very hot and was so quick it left behind absolutely zero residue on the paper, which continued to sit unburnt and hardly disturbed. Sella theorized perhaps a similar flash or sound of explosion was enough to frighten the crew into quickly evacuating the Celeste out of fear that an imminent explosion was due to take place and destroy the ship. The heavy alcoholic vapors which sat inside the cargo hold perhaps could have been ignited from the metal rings which held the wooden barrels together, rubbing together as the waves rocked the ship, or maybe a slip of the mind. A crew member could have tried lighting his pipe for a smoke and accidentally igniting a quick explosion which caused him and the rest of the crew to panic. With this possibly being what happened, the crew acted quickly and only gathered a few essentials such as navigation tools and very little else, jumped into the lifeboat and departed the ship. If this were the case, the realization of watching the Mary Celeste sail away and not exploding like they thought it would, well, it must have made every heart in that lifeboat sink, knowing they were now stranded, and very likely never to be found. It really doesn't matter what theory one wishes to believe. At this point, so much time has passed, there's no way of knowing what circumstances truly caused the crew of the Mary Celeste to depart the ship, and every theory leads to the same conclusion. Captain Briggs and his family, along with the crew, all perished in some way. I personally am a believer in the last theory involving a possible explosion happening on board, as it's logically the most convincing and reasonable, I find. With very little evidence of anything else happening, and this theory proving to us that nothing would be left behind after an explosion on board, it's probably our best bet. Whatever the case though, if they did manage to find their way onto the lifeboat with their navigation tools, they most likely would have ended up heading back to the closest piece of dry land they could, which would have been Santa Maria Island. This, however, could have proven to be fruitless, as the cold waves of the Atlantic Ocean more than likely had toppled the lifeboat they were on, completely swallowing it and its passengers into the dark blue water. It's very much a dark conclusion to this story, which remains a compelling mystery today as it did nearly 150 years ago. And even though we have so many ideas and theories about how the lost crew of the Mary Celeste became lost, the fact remains they continue to remain so. It's very unlikely at this point we'll ever know the true fate of Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah and their daughter Sophia, and the rest of the crew of the Mary Celeste. This whole story only serves as a reminder. The ocean is a cold, unforgiving force, and even the smallest of mistakes could result with anyone becoming not only lost, but also becoming a mystery of their own. Hey there everyone, I just wanted to jump in at the end of the episode to let you all know Moonlight Lore has an Instagram page and also now a Twitter page where I've been and will continue to post pictures and updates of specific episodes talked about on the podcast. If you're interested, feel free to give me a follow on Instagram at Moonlight Lore Podcast or at Lore Moonlight on Twitter, and if you're wondering how you could help support and grow the podcast, simply by listening does just that. But if you want to go even further, leaving a 5-star review on whatever app you're listening on, and by sharing this podcast with your friends and family who you think might also be interested, would help immensely. I appreciate you all listening to Moonlight Lore, so thank you, and I hope you've been enjoying it. Please do take care and stay safe.